Okay, so thank you all for coming. This is so exciting. I did this the last day of security, and hopefully I'll do it in person next year. But this is investigating security events. So really appreciate you coming. Like I said, if you just joined, for those of you that pre-registered, I did send out your instance URLs and your credentials beforehand. I also put some stuff in the chat over here, so like a reference guide to some commands, my LinkedIn, and my email. As I just mentioned, you will have access to these instances until the 22nd at 8 a.m. Central Time. I'm so sorry. I do have dogs, and sometimes they get a little bit rowdy, but you will have access to these. So if you're playing around in them after the fact, please feel free to just email me. You can DM me on LinkedIn. I'm very responsive. So if you have any particular questions, happy to walk through some of those. So who am I and why am I giving this presentation, this workshop today? So I'm Cassandra Murphy. Please feel free to call me Kassy. And I'm a senior consulting solutions engineer. I actually do work at Splunk. But before this, I was a SOC analyst for a really long time. I was in the Navy for about 6 years and did some cyber defense analyst work there. I did some cybersecurity engineering for NASA at Goddard Space Flight Center. And then I moved into the private sector. So I actually worked at Rackspace before I moved over to Splunk. So I've been at Splunk for about 2 years. And really what my role is here at Splunk is I work with customers to prove out or assist with solutions based on some of their different security use cases. So whether that is, utilizing a SIM or just, a log aggregator or automation platform, whatever it may be, I help facilitate some of that. So another thing about me, you've already heard, but I am a dog mom. Some would say a dog fanatic. I have a couple rescue dogs. I also foster dogs. So you will certainly hear them once again at some point on this call, and apologies in advance for that. I also have dual monitors. So I have my deck and my instance up. If you see me looking around, I've got a lot going on here. So our agenda today is going to be, why investigating? What are we doing when we're investigating these security events? What are we trying to do here? We'll also go through a scenario for you that we're going to be working on today. We're doing investigating an APT today, but like I mentioned, there is another scenario available to you within the instance itself, and I'll show you how to access that if you want to dig into that over the weekend. So really, I just want you to leave this workshop with a better understanding of how to use your data, your logs, to investigate different security events and how to identify different problems in your environment. So we are going to be using Splunk as our log aggregator today because I work here. I do have access to these instances for y'all. But keep in mind, the foundational components are the important pieces I want you to take away from it. How to investigate these events, as well as how to look at these different data sources and think about your data in some of the ways that we will be today, answering some of these questions of your data, pivoting around on that data. And that's going to be applicable regardless of what tool you're using. So the format and searches are, of course, going to be, Splunk specific, but those will be a little bit different depending on what tool you're actually using. But just think about the actual, components of investigating. That's really what I want you to get out of this. So I'm sure we all know what investigate means, but I do like to define it because this first definition is really what I think is perfect when we're thinking about, investigating security events specifically. We're carrying out a systematic inquiry to discover and examine facts, right? To establish some sort of truth. That's really what we're doing when we're investigating. And I always like to think of security events as like a giant puzzle, right? And we're using Splunk today, or whatever log aggregator you use in your day-to-day life, to sift through all of these puzzle pieces and then create that better picture of what actually occurred. This also applies if you are, an analyst, or also if you're an incident response person, if you're a threat hunter, if you have an insider threat team. It is a core competency for any of these different roles. So it's not just for analysts. This is definitely, more of a beginner level workshop for defense analysts, but this can be applicable to a lot of different roles as well. So So what happened here today? What is our scenario? What are we going to be doing? What are we trying to figure out? So this workshop, we're going to be coming in from a reactive standpoint, right? So we're going to assume the persona of this gal here on my screen. Her name is Alice Bluebird, and she's an analyst who has been recently hired to protect and defend Wayne Enterprises. That's who we're working for. And we just started and we're confronted already, day 2, with this web defacement. And our manager said, hey, you need to figure out what's going on here. You know, our main website's been defaced. It says Poison Ivy was here. What is this? So as I mentioned before, we are going to be using Splunk, but we're going to be using not our actual SIM solution. That's called Enterprise Security. We're going to be using Splunk Enterprise, which is like our core, software here that we have at Splunk, because we don't actually have a SIM tool, which is fine. We can answer a lot of these questions with that today. So fortunately for Alice, we have tons of logs already being sent into Splunk. So we do have all of the information that we need to investigate this. And I typically like to pose this question to you too. Obviously, I've already put the answers on the screen, but think of, some of the most beneficial types of data as it pertains to security operations, right? You typically want to think of like firewall or endpoint, some of those different kinds of logs. Get your brain thinking about the data in that way too, just so you understand how many different avenues you have to answer some of these different questions. So these are the types of data we're going to be working with today. We have some Sysmon data, we have Windows events, we have registry logs, IIS or web server logs. We have a Splunk stream, and it is a specific type of networking across the wire data that we do use at Splunk. But think of it kind of as like PCAP light. Like you don't have all of the full PCAP information, but you do get a lot of header information and things like that. So that'll be helpful to our investigation today. We also have Suricata logs and then FortiGate logs as well. Now, I did send out this reference guide for, when you're working on this in the future and just for y'all to have in general. But these are going to be some of the commands that we're using today. I do not expect you to memorize all of these right now or throughout the workshop. It'll guide you through a lot of these. So don't feel like, oh, no, I don't know what these are and I need to hurry up and educate myself. Don't worry about it. That's part of the workshop. I did just want to give you kind of an overview of some of the different commands that we're going to be using. So I know that some people are familiar with Splunk, some people are not. Totally get that, and that's all right. So a couple other things I just wanted to add for some like housekeeping pieces here. So the data repositories within Splunk, they're called indexes. So when we bring in data to Splunk, it's going to transform all of that incoming data into events, and they're stored in these indexes. Just think like buckets of data, right? And so that's where we'll actually be searching, is within these repositories, if you will, these indexes. And then the second thing I want to mention is source types. So a source type in Splunk, it's one of our default fields that Splunk actually assigns to all of our incoming data. And it basically just tells Splunk what kind of data it is. So if you have like Cisco ASA logs or SourceFire events or whatever it may be, that's going to be your source type. Think data type. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started here. So please go ahead and log into your instance if you have not done so already. I'll give y'all a couple of seconds to do that. I'm just going to take a drink of water. And once you're logged in, you're going to see on the left side of your screen here where it says Investigating with Splunk Workshop underneath the section called Apps. Please go ahead and click on that. All right. So once you've done that, this is the first screen that you are going to see. So it's a quick overview of the 2 investigations we could cover, but the one investigation that we are going to cover today, which is going to be the APT scenario. So you can see up at the top, you can see it on my slides as well. It'll say overview, scenario 1, scenario 2, and then you have reference materials. That also includes a command reference guide and a couple of other helpful items that you may want to dig into if you're playing around with these instances over the weekend. And then additionally, that scenario number 2, that ransomware scenario, please feel free to work through that on your own time. Like I said, we probably won't get to that today, but it is in there for your use. So the goal of this whole app is for you to be able to search, but it's also going to show you the results of the searches that we're writing to find the answers to our investigation. So I'll stop throughout to give you a chance to, try your hand at some of the searches, maybe pivot around a little bit. And it's very intuitive. It's really nice and walks you through in a way that makes sense. But of course, if you get stuck or you have any questions or anything at all, please put it in the chat. I have the chat up on the other side of my screen here, so I can take a look at that and help guide you along a little bit too. So anytime you see a pink arrow on my deck here, that means you're going to need to scroll down. So if you could scroll down to the bottom of this overview page and click next, reviewing all data available, that is where we are headed next. I'll give you a couple seconds to get there. Okay, so this page says, what kind of events do I have? So each of the screens today are going to be laid out in a similar manner like this. So the top section, it's going to have the question that we're trying to answer here. It's going to give some background about the question, any additional resources. It's also going to mention the kill chain and then the source types. Remember, those types of data that are applicable in this instance. So if you don't use the Lockheed Martin kill chain, that's fine. I myself use the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and I will touch briefly on that today as well. But just for ease of understanding the general threat landscape, we do use the kill chain in this workshop specifically. So you'll see some of that as well. Below that is going to be a section that includes the syntax of our search. It's going to include the executed search as well as a green button that lets you run the search in its own tab so you can get the results on your own and then pivot around in the data a little bit more. You can modify the search if you're feeling froggy. We know that everybody has, different experience levels, not only, just with Splunk in general, but just in investigating these security events. So I do want to give you some different ways to approach these questions, different ways to dig into the data and all of that. And then at the bottom of each page, there's going to be a navigation bar that lets you jump to the next objective, or you can go back to the previous one. So what kinds of events do I have? I kind of mentioned some of the source types that we're going to be working with today. And this is going to break all of those down for you. So when you log into just regular Splunk, the search and reporting app, there is a section on there that says what to search. And it has a button called data summary. So you can click on that, you get a pop-up box, and you can look at the different hosts and sources and source types and all of that sort of stuff, which is great. But in case, in this instance, like with this app, we don't have the ability to do that. We did go ahead and just run the Splunk command metadata, because that can be used to search for the same kind of information, that metadata, information about your data, with the added bonus of being able to search within a specific index. So if I have, for example, today, we're going to be looking at our bots data index. If you're familiar with Boss of the SOC that we run, it's like a capture the flag style event. That's the type of data we're working with today. So that is what we're actually running here. You'll see on your what kinds of events do I have page, that metadata command. It says pipe metadata type source types index equals bots v1. That's saying give me the information on all of the data in that bucket. Remember the index, the bucket of data called bots v1, and show me all of the different source types. So when you scroll down, you can see all the different types of data or source types that we're working with today. Touched on them a couple slides ago when I mentioned, Windows event logs, but now you can actually see what that looks like. So time to get into our scenario now that I have all of that foundational stuff out of the way. So go ahead and click on our scenario 1 for APT. You can also scroll down to the bottom of your screen and click the next, and it should take you to the same place, the APT prologue. I'll give you a couple seconds to get here while I take a drink. All right, perfect. So you should see what I see here on my screen. And the first incident we're dealing with is, of course, I already mentioned, our website defacement, and it is from the Poison Ivy APT group. Now, in the real world, I myself have never been faced with a situation where an attacker identified themselves so quickly. So that was really nice of them to do that for us today. But this is what everybody's seeing on the Wayne Enterprises system when they're logging in today. So it's up to us, Alice, the security analyst, brand new, day 2, to figure out what happened here. I touched on this briefly, but for this scenario, we are going to be laying out our findings using the Lockheed Martin kill chain. I love the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and we do use that a lot at Splunk as well, but this is a really easy and clean way to map some of the activities that we're seeing today to, like I said, the greater, threat landscape picture. So if you're not familiar with the kill chain, that's okay too. It's been around since like 2010 or so, and it just allows analysts to contextualize different events of an advanced threat into a logical chain of events. So from start to finish, what happened during this attack? How did this attack play out? The point that they're making here is we just want you to understand all the different steps that the adversary goes through during an attack, because that creates an opportunity for us as the defender to interdict along this kill chain so we can deny or disrupt the attack. Maybe if we're seeing some activity in the reconnaissance phase, but we haven't seen some of these other, tactics for, I'm thinking MITRE ATT&CK, but we haven't seen some of these other items like, C2 or actions on objectives. We know that we still probably have time to get in there and remediate the situation, mitigate whatever's going to happen, maybe contain some devices, whatever it may be. So it's really nice from both perspectives in that way. So during an investigation, there are a number of questions that need to be answered. So some of our questions today are going to build off of earlier questions. You don't need to have a notepad and pencil necessarily if you just want to type it up in a document, or just remember some of these things like maybe IP addresses that we'll be looking at. Just keep that in mind. So after each question, I will give you a couple minutes to let you work on it, and then we'll walk through answering the question together. There are so many different reference items within the questions themselves on each of those screens. So I'll give you a couple minutes to digest that and work through some of those hints and things like that. And then, of course, if you still have questions, feel free to ask me in the chat. So hopefully everybody is ready to answer our first question. So you're going to want to, awesome. Yeah, thanks, Mindy. That's cool. So you're going to want to scroll down and click on next, and we're going to be doing finding the IP scanning your web server. So go ahead and scroll down, hit that, and you'll get to our first question, that page that's going to walk you through this. So what we're trying to answer here is, what is the likely IP address of someone from the Poison Ivy APT group scanning I'mNotReallyBatman.com for web application vulnerabilities? So a couple hints here. All of the searches that we're using today are going to be searching that index, that bucket of data of bots v1. We are looking for a particular field called source, or SRC. The data in Splunk is broken up into key value pairs. You'll see that in here. So it's basically going to be, SRC and then the IP address or whatever it may be. Focusing your search on specific source types or those types of data is going to be helpful in navigating you to the right answer here. So you'll see within your instance, it's going to walk you through, step 1, what you need to look at. It'll give you the search and allow you to run it. So you're just going to work through it in that way. But if you have any questions at all, let me know in the chat. I'm going to give y'all about 5 minutes to work through this first one, just to get yourselves familiar with the app and familiar with, the commands of what we're doing here. But let me know if you have any questions in the chat. Obviously, I'm going to be right here, but I will mute myself so you don't hear me like messing around at my desk. So, all right, cool. Let's take 5 and we will reconvene at 29 after the hour. I'm going to put that in the chat as well in case you forget at any point in time. All right, have at it. All right, I don't see any other issues. Can you hear me now, Maureen? Okay, perfect. Yeah, for sure. Okay, great. Well, then does one brave soul want to maybe put the answer in our chat here? What is the likely IP address of someone from our APT group that's scanning our webpage? Perfect, Mindy. Thank you so much. Awesome. Okay, well, let's walk through it and see how we got there. Okay, so the first search that we're running here, we're looking at our index of bots v1. And we just went ahead and threw in our I'mNotReallyBatman.com domain here. So what we're trying to do is understand the different source types that are scanning our website, I'mNotReallyBatman.com. From there, we're just drilling down to further iterate on that search or build on that search to find the specific IP address that's actually performing the scan. So this initial search that's being done, we're looking for the address. We're clicking on over in the left-hand side, the selected field section. We're clicking on source type so we can see the different source types or the types of data that we have available to us that reference I'mNotReallyBatman.com. Also, I'll apologize in advance. My house is very old and my floor is very squeaky and I'm standing. So if you hear some creaks, don't worry about it. I'm okay. It's just my floor. So that said, when we click on source type, we can see Suricata data. We can see stream data, which again, remember, is just like network data, traffic on the wire. We can see FortiGate data, and we can see IIS data. So we know that all of these source types have our I'mNotReallyBatman.com website referenced in them in some way. From there, we're going to look at the SRC field. So it's very similar to what we just did, except we're expanding on the source address. So note that I am running this search with the time picker set to all time. If you're doing an investigation in your production environment, it's probably more ideal from a performance and just volume of data perspective to focus on a smaller time frame. But for the purposes of today, totally fine to run it to all time. And then, like I mentioned earlier, if you do see this arrow on my screen, please feel free to scroll down, because if I'm talking about something and you're not seeing it, it's probably just down on the screen a little bit more. So those interesting field section, that's going to pertain to that section a lot as well, because I will be talking about some different fields that we're clicking on and pivoting from our searches in that way. So what I've chosen to do is drill down in the source type of stream, because we are looking for scanning of our website for vulnerabilities. So I do want to see what kind of web data I have that's actually being seen on the wire that pertains to I'mNotReallyBatman.com. So when I click on source type over on the left, I'm just going to select stream HTTP. That adds that to my search. That's how you would do this in here. I know the search is already crafted for you in your instance, but that's how you would kind of just pivot around and get to some of these different searches without having to build them yourself. So when I look in my index and then my source type of stream, and then look at I'mNotReallyBatman.com. Then if I expand that SRC field again, I actually only see 2 IP addresses vice the 5 or 6 that I saw with some of those other source types still present. So what I'm doing is just narrowing my search down a little bit. I do this a lot in security investigations in general, right? You may cast a wide net and then you're kind of just starting to drill down into the more relevant pieces of data that make more sense for you. So that's all we're doing here. And what I see here are 2 source IPs that are seen in my HTTP traffic that reference I'mNotReallyBatman.com. I see one of them is associated with 95% of the traffic. So that's a pretty good sign that that's probably what I'm looking for. But I always like to validate my findings with other source types as well. I was told a long time ago when I very first started out as a baby security analyst to try to prove yourself wrong sometimes. And I think this is kind of similar to that because we can tend to go down a rabbit hole occasionally and, you know, maybe find at the end of that we were not looking down the right path at all. So I just like to validate my findings in that way. And we're going to do that in the next search. So I'm going to utilize my Suricata data in this next search to verify I'm still seeing the same type of traffic. So different data sets are going to provide different perspectives to your data, right? So if I'm looking at, data from my firewall logs, or if I'm looking at wire data, it's going to be a little bit different. Suricata is, an IDS tool. Basically, there's some other things that it does as well. But so I'm just going to pivot to that data source to make sure I'm seeing the same types of stuff. So when I put in, my same index, again, we're going to be searching that the whole time. I'm not really Batman.com. I have my source IP in question that was associated with 95% of the traffic in my last search. And then I look in the source type of Suricata. I can see, I do have all kinds of different information about that same traffic within this data as well. But because Suricata has IDS signatures associated with it, I want to scroll through the interesting field section over there on the left and see if I can actually take a look at some of those IDS signatures, if those could point me to, verifying that this is in fact some scanning information or scanning data, or, potentially malicious data, whatever it may be. So if you scroll down on the interesting field section on the left, all kinds of fields available to you. Sometimes you can't see all of them because they just may not have a great deal of coverage. So you can actually open up, it says more fields down at the very bottom of that section. So you can open that as well and take a look at maybe some more fields that don't have a ton of information associated with them, but they are within there. I mentioned at the beginning, but these fields within our data in Splunk, they're key value pairs. So we're just extracting them when we're searching the data. So when you dispatch a search in here, Splunk's going to try to use any sort of delimiter. So like an equal sign or a colon sign, and it's going to assign the value on the left as the field, and then the value on the right as the value. And then it's taking those and it's listing them under this interesting field section. So that's how you're actually getting to that data. Now, when I do that and I click on 19 more fields underneath my interesting fields section, I get a pop-up with all of these additional fields, this additional information that's available to me in my Suricata data specifically. So I went ahead and filtered for signature because I'm looking for IDS signatures that maybe verify that this IP is scanning my I'm not really Batman.com. So I've just typed in SIG to bring up the signature section instead of scrolling through. You could also scroll through. And I do have a signature field here. And if I expand on that, I can see a number of different IDS signatures that do look to be web application vulnerability signatures, thus proving to me that that source IP in our search is in fact the one conducting my scan. So I've looked at this through my stream data, and now I have verified it with my Suricata data. Pretty confident that the 40 dot is the IP that is scanning my website. So good call, Mindy. Thank you for that. Keep in mind, there are tons of different ways to conduct these searches. So all of that work that we just did, pivoting around on those interesting fields, pivoting around on the source types, what you could do is just type in this search here that you see on my screen to get those results. But of course, I want you to do it the hard way so you can think about pivoting through your data, regardless of what tool you're using to get some of these different answers. And then also keep in mind, using answers or information from other data sources is going to help you validate your findings. Just going to give you the confidence that what you're looking for is, correct or maybe incorrect. So in this search, I've just added, I'm looking at my bucket of data, that index bots v1 for my I'm not really Batman.com at my stream source type. And then what I'm doing is doing a stats count, which is just counting the number of requests by source IP, and then I'm sorting that information. So that's what this search is doing. And I can see here that, yep, does look like that 40 dot is making the most requests to I'm not really Batman.com. So as we go through this, I'm going to be filling out the kill chain here. We talked about it a minute ago, but I'm just going to be putting this information where it falls within the kill chain. And then we'll also do a threat picture, an APT picture, which you'll see on my next slide. So since this is scanning behavior, we're putting this in the reconnaissance section of the kill chain. And then we're going to start to build out this threat picture. So at the end of this, we can see everything that's going on in our overall threat landscape today. So I have this system out here, this 40 dot, that is performing a vulnerability scan to I'mNotReallyBatman.com. Any questions about that first one before we move on to the next? I know we covered a lot in a short amount of time already. So any questions at all before we move on? All right. I don't see anything. So for our next question. So as we move on to this next question, it's also important to remember that when you're investigating, some results may lead to additional questions, and you may be able to utilize searches that you've already created to continue down that path. So maybe outputs from previous searches are going to provide you with some hints to your next question. So in this instance, we want to identify the web vulnerability scanner that is actually being used in this scanning activity. So we want to know what company created the web vulnerability scanner used by our Poison Ivy APT. You can see some hints here on my screen. I won't read them all to you this time just for the sake of time, but take a look at those and I'll give you 5 minutes to work through this question and then we'll reconvene and walk through it just like we did the last one. So we will discuss at 46 after the hour. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will be standing right here and I will be monitoring it. Okay, have at it. All right, so if someone wants to put the answer to this question in the chat, that would be awesome. And then we'll walk through how we got there together. Perfect. Yep, you're absolutely right. It is Acunetics. And how did we get there? All right, so what we're doing on this first search here, since we know from answering our previous question that the web vulnerability scans originated from that 40 dot, we're going to start by looking at the source from the 40 dot. And we're going to dig into our source headers so we can get some clues that are related to that tool being used for our scan. Yep. Yeah, I don't know if they offer a free version anymore. This is from our bots v1 data. So I think we're on bots v8 at this point. So that may be a little bit outdated, but this definitely did used to be an option. Yeah. So what we're doing here is using our source IP, that 40 dot, looking at our stream data, and then we're just expanding the field src_headers. And if you scroll through there, you can see a couple different things. I'll zoom in on my next slide. So I can see a couple that do say exactly what Mindy put in the chat here, this Acunetics Web Vulnerability Scanner free. I can see in a couple different events here, so that is pretty definitive. I'm also going to take it a step further and look in some other fields on my wire data or my stream data. I'm actually going to expand the HTTP_user_agent. And within there, I see a couple of interesting, unusual, I would say, agent strings. And in a couple of those, I can also see Acunetics within there as well. Now, unfortunately, maybe I'm not well versed in web application vulnerability scanners, which is fine. So what am I to do? Well, this sounds very basic, but you would not believe that a lot of people don't do this. So if we see something that we don't know what it is, Google it. Again, this sounds very simple and very obvious, but you'd be surprised, or maybe not. That's not the immediate go-to for a lot of folks. They, maybe assume that they should know something. If you don't, it's okay though. Just give it a Goog, as I like to say. So, as you can see here from my Google search, Acunetics is in fact a web vulnerability scanner. May not have a free version anymore, as Mindy pointed out, but that helps me confirm that, yep, this is exactly what I'm looking for. So what company created my web vulnerability scanner? It is Acunetics. Just including that here under my IP address in my kill chain under reconnaissance. And I'm just also adding it here to my APT picture in case I need to refer back to that scanner in the future. All right, any questions about that one before we move on to the next? Everybody good to go? Looks like we're good. All right, so the next thing we want to do is determine which web server is our target. So what content management system is I'm not really Batman.com likely using. So this question's similar to the previous couple in the sense that we're just trying to get our bearings and figure out all the systems that are operating within our environment. And so I want to know what's running on my website because IT and dev may not have told us how our applications are built. Thankfully, these days we're moving into some more DevSecOps and DevOps practices, but typically in a SOC or as a security analyst, you may not actually know what architecture or infrastructure is running. So once we understand things like that underlying technology, we can then also understand the vulnerabilities associated with that technology. So now not only am I thinking, okay, well, this is being scanned, but what's it being scanned for? Is it actually vulnerable for whatever is being, obviously if they're running a scan, they're just checking for different vulnerabilities, but what may be available? So then I can either hopefully step in and handle that, mitigate that vulnerability before it's actually exploited, on and on and on. So what we're doing now is trying to figure that out so that we understand, what vulnerabilities are actually associated here. So what content management system is I'm not really Batman.com likely using? Let's take 5 to answer this. You have your hints on the slide here if you run into any trouble. So we'll reconvene at 55 after and we'll walk through this one. All right, have at it. Alrighty, so what content management system is I'm not really Batman.com using? Any guesses in the chat? Joomla, perfect. Yes, wonderful. Thank you for those responses. Awesome, you are right. So let's start off. Again, I'm a security analyst. I don't know anything about web servers. And so therefore, I don't know anything about content management systems. What do? I go back to Google. What is a web CMS system? That is redundant, actually. But I went ahead and did that already. So it is a content management system, and that is how I manage the content on my website. So now that I know a little bit more about that, should I figure out the different kinds of logs that I would need to dig in deeper to this question? So you can do this in a real world scenario, right? If you're like, okay, what am I looking for? Okay, well, what kinds of data would actually contain that information? So in this instance, that's what we're going to do. And we also want to identify the IP address when we're doing this. So based on what we've discovered in the first 2 questions, we have a pretty good idea of some of the logs that we can look at to at least identify the IP address of the system in question. So what I'm doing here is I'm using my stream source type again and my source address of that 40 dot to determine where all of those scans are actually being directed. So if I run that, I can see I have 2 IP addresses here. 99.9% of that traffic is going to this 192.168.250.70. So I can pretty well infer that that is the destination IP. So I'm going to go ahead and use that for my search to drill down into the URI to figure out what the scanner is actually requesting. So that's what I'm doing in this search. I have my index, my destination IP, and I'm looking at that stream data. And so what I'm going to do is expand the URLs or URIs to get an idea of the kind of files and the different directory structures that are actually being requested. And that will be indicative of what is actually running on the system. So as I'm looking through that, I can see the word Joomla on a number of these different directory trees. And in the instance that I did not know what Joomla was, I could just Google that and make sure that it is in fact a CMS, which in this instance, I've already done for you, and I can see that here. So it sounds like we're on the right path. Now, this is going to break down a more efficient search that we could use here. So let's take our original search to find those URIs and improve it a little bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding a status of 200 to my search to indicate successful page loads. Then I'm adding a transformational search command called stats. We talked about it a couple questions ago, but that's just going to count. It does a couple other things, but I'm doing a count here for the number of events grouped by URI. So I'm saying, look in my bucket of data for this destination of 192 dot in the data type of stream. that have a status of 200. Then think of the pipe as like a then count them by URI. So count my events by URI. And then I'm going to sort it. In this instance, I'm doing a negative, a minus sign count. That's going to sort in descending order. If I just did sort count, it would sort them in ascending order. So in this instance, if I run this search, these are the results that I get, and I can very easily see all of those URIs. I see the count over there on the right side. And again, I can see that I have Joomla in a lot of these URLs. So I don't just want to take that at face value. I'm pretty confident that it's Joomla, but I'm going to verify it from another perspective. To do this, I'm going to take a look at the IIS logs because those are Windows Server logs and my web servers are Windows servers, so I can validate this information a little bit more. So in my search, now I'm looking again for a status of 200, but in this instance, I'm looking at the source type, that data type of IIS. Again, I'm doing a stats for the values that are within the URI, and when I run that search, I do get a lot of Joomla as well. So I've come in from two different perspectives, and I can confidently confirm in this instance that I'mNotReallyBatman.com is in fact using Joomla. So again, when you're doing these searches in your own environment, whatever tool you're using, think of it from these different perspectives of the data, the different types of data. Think of everything that you have available to you. If you don't know what data you have available to you, that's a really great starting point. Typically, you can, depending on the tool that you have, you can run a search like we did at the very beginning of the workshop today to see some of those data types available to you. Or you could also ask if you have security engineers or content engineers, those types of people on your team, they're probably going to know as well, but that's a really good starting point. So it is Joomla, and I'm going to just go ahead and add that in here to my reconnaissance section of my kill chain as well, adding the IP address of my web server for I'mNotReallyBatman.com over there on the right too. All right, so we finished that one up. We're going to actually move into a different phase of the kill chain now. We're going to start getting into the exploitation phase of our kill chain. So what I want to know now, because, obviously the adversary is trying to exploit my system in some way to gain access, I want to see what's going on here. So in a targeted malware attack, this exploitation could have been done via malware. They could have, somehow either with a phishing email or whatever it may be, dropped, a piece of malware that contained a 0-day or all kinds of different crazy things could happen. But in this example, what actually happened is that Poison Ivy seems to be just hammering away at our systems with login attempts. So they're actually performing a brute force attack here on our web server. So what I want to know is what IP address is likely attempting a brute force password attack against my I'mNotReallyBatman.com. So I'll give you all 5 minutes to work through this one, and we will reconvene and walk through this together at 07 after the hour. Alrighty, so what is the IP address that is likely attempting a brute force password attack against I'mNotReallyBatman.com? You can drop it in the chat here if you would. Okay. All right. Perfect. Okay. So this question and the next question are not trick questions, but it does get you thinking about the data a little bit more. So that's kind of why we have these two in here. That said, I know we are getting close to time, so we'll walk through this one. And I would definitely like to do the next one. Yeah, they tried some interesting stuff. Yes, and we can look at some of that in a bit too. But that said, I do want to get through this one and then also the next one just to kind of bring this part full circle. We will not probably finish the investigation today, but I will put these slides in the Slack so you can continue to work through this APT scenario, but also the ransomware scenario. And even without the slides, you can see how it's laid out. So you still have access to all of the questions and the answers themselves. But just for the sake of time, just wanted to point that out. Perfect. Thank you, Mindy. Okay, cool. So because Stream, as we know, allows us to look at the HTTP traffic, we're going to start here again. So like I mentioned before, we're just starting with a broad search and then casting that wide net and then kind of drilling down from there. That's totally fine to do in your real environment as well. So we're going to just start with that search of our whole index, our big bucket of data, and then the source type of Stream HTTP. And then we're just going to pivot into the source of traffic to see that there are a lot of different source IP addresses here that are actually associated with these HTTP events. So because we've been taking such good notes throughout our investigation, we do know what IP address is associated with our I'mNotReallyBatman.com website. So we can start to pivot from there. So I've added that as the destination in my search now, excuse me. And what I want to do is look for HTTP traffic going to that IP address. When I pivot on the source IPs, I can see I have 3 source IPs of interest. 2 are external. 1 looks familiar to us. So we have our 40 dot that we've seen before. And then we have this 23 dot. So if I then pivot on this same search to look at the HTTP method of these requests, we see twice as many posts as we do gets. So think about this in terms of what's actually going on in your data here. We're talking about a brute force password attack. So what is the most likely HTTP method for this kind of attack? Because this is a browser or a client pushing requests to our web server, right? So that is most likely going to be a post and not a get. They're not requesting anything from my web server. We're trying to push stuff to it. So when you're thinking about that, that'll also help you drill down a little bit if you're really thinking about, okay, what am I looking for here and what makes sense to try and answer this question? So I went ahead and added that to my search, the HTTP method of post. And when I do that, I only see 2 source IP addresses now. Vast majority are coming from my 40 dot, but then I also have this 23 dot, right? So in the hints from earlier on that last slide, I had on there that the form_data field contains information being passed from the client browser to the web browser, or excuse me, web server. So in order to narrow down our results a little bit more, and because we know that the brute force attacks are trying to do a brute force for a username and password, we're going to look in that form_data field, and we can use wildcards to look for values that contain these strings because maybe we don't know how they're presented. We don't know how they're laid out in the data itself. Does it say password and then username, username and then password? Is there stuff in between? I have no idea. So I'm going to use wildcards in this instance just to make sure I, again, cast that wide net to get what I'm looking for. So that's what I've done here is I'm looking in form_data for wildcard username, wildcard password, wildcard. And that just tells me anywhere that username or password is present within that form data field, give me those results. So that's what I've added to the search here. This can be a pretty expensive search if you're doing this in your environment. So just be careful when you're doing stuff like this. Make sure your time is narrowed. Make sure you're looking at the right buckets of data or indexes, that sort of thing, just as an aside. And what I get from that, I'm adding a table command to it as well, just so I can review my results a little bit better. And when I do that, I can see all of the different events and I can see their form data field, and I can see within there all of these different username and password combinations. So take note of this too, because you can see that sometimes the password is near the front of the string and other times it's in the back of the string. So when you're running searches, sometimes whatever you're using and you're not finding results, but you know that there's data in there, think about some of these things as well. Oh, maybe, you know, I need to use a wildcard here, or maybe it's in a different format than I'm expecting. Try to think about some of that as well when you're running these searches, and that'll, you know, hopefully help you find what you're trying to look for. So if I then do this same search, but then add a stats count by source, if you remember, stats will count by whatever I'm throwing in at the end here. So I look for my bots v1 bucket, my stream source type, my destination IP, that HTTP method of post and that form data for username and password. Show me all of that, but count it by the source field. What I get here is both of those IPs, but I can see very clearly that the 23 dot is the one that's actually performing this post with that form data field of those usernames and passwords to my destination IP here. So you may have thought when you ran that first search, oh, it's going to be the 40 dot. That's the one who's scanning. But actually in this instance, based on these results, you can see it as actually the 23 dot. So that's another instance of maybe try to prove yourself wrong sometimes, because you could have stopped at that last search and thought, oh, well, it's the 40 dot. That makes sense to me. And it would, but just dig a little bit deeper, verify your results, validate your findings, so on and so forth. Okay, so what IP address? It is our 23 dot. So great guess, Cynthia and Jasmine. Thank you for that. And since we have moved on to the exploitation phase, I'm going to add the 23 dot here in this section. And I'm also adding this new system out here in my APT picture because we have this other host that is performing a brute force password attempt to my I'mNotReallyBatman.com. All right, so I do just want to touch on MITRE really quick here, because while the kill chain is very useful for contextualizing intrusions, and I kind of already mentioned this before, it is not a one size fits all. So in the case of a brute force attack, it doesn't really fit neatly into the kill chain because the gateway into the system itself is actually due to like poor security, really, and not an actual exploit that's being delivered to the system. So the MITRE attack framework is good for that sort of thing because it does have more specific TTPs. Just something to mention here, depending on what framework you use, one or the other may be more beneficial if you're trying to outline something like this. Okay, we're going to run through this last question. I have about 10 minutes left, and I don't know if they're going to kick me out right at 4:25. So I'll try to get through this one with you guys. We'll only take 3 minutes to walk through this one or to let you answer this one so that we can walk through it at the end. So what I want to know now is what was the first brute force password used here in our brute force attempt. So we'll take 3 minutes, we'll reconvene at 18 and walk through it and wrap everything up. Okay, good luck. I have my form_data strings here, and I've put it into a table with the time and then my data that's in that field, because this way I'm sorting it by time so that I can see which one was the first. But there's a couple different ways we can make this a little bit easier. So I can do a sort command, or I can do a reverse command. So the sort command, we've used it before. It'll sort my rows, or I can do a reverse command, which will reverse the order of my rows here based on my search results. And it doesn't change the order of the rows based on the values. So that's kind of the differentiating piece here. So what I'll do here is add that reverse command before I do the table. And when I do that, I get the output of my result set that are flipped, so I can actually see the form_data with the first password that was actually attempted. So if I look within here, what I can see is my username of admin was attempted and this password of 1234567 Now, there is a better way to do this. So we can actually extract fields on the fly within here in order to make a new field out of something else. And so what I mean by that is we have our usernames and passwords in that form_data field. I'm going to use regex to actually extract the password itself from that other field, create a new field, and then present it to me. This is getting a little bit more into the weeds, but this is just to show you a more efficient way that you could have found this answer. So what we're doing here is creating a new field called user password from that form data, pulling out that specific piece of it, and then making a new field. And all I've really done here is just searched for it, done a reverse, and then asked it to present me one result here. So essentially giving us our same answer, just in a much quicker fashion. So that does require some knowledge of Splunk commands, but that's just to show you, there's multiple ways to do things here. So we will not be going on to this next question because we will run out of time, but please feel free to work through the rest of the questions within this APT scenario, but also within that ransomware scenario. So I mentioned that these instances are up for you until the 22nd at 8 a.m. Central. So you have plenty of time to mess around in these instances. You cannot break them, I promise you. People have tried. So just feel free to look around in the different data within here, the different scenarios, all those reference materials. I did put my LinkedIn in the chat earlier. I'll put it in there one more time, along with my email address. So if you're working through these later and you're like, dang it, I wish I could ask her a question, you can just message me and I am very responsive. So shoot me any questions. I'll put the deck in the Slack channel under the, I believe it is conference session resources. So I'll get this printed out in PDF and I'll throw it in there here momentarily. Any other questions for me before I get kicked out of here? I have 3 more minutes, so anything at all, happy to help. Awesome. Thank you for that, Jasmine. Yeah, please do. Definitely explore as much as you can. Anything else from anybody else here? Any other questions? Any thoughts, comments, feedback? Okay, awesome. Great. All right, y'all. Well, have a good rest of day of security, or if you're attending in person tomorrow, also have so much fun. I'm in St. Louis, so I'm quite far away for that, so I will not be there in person, but maybe next year. Awesome. All right, y'all. Well, have a good rest of the day, and if you think of anything else, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or email. Awesome. Thanks, y'all.